Hello, everyone. I hope that everyone can see my screen okay. Welcome to today's webinar entitled Navigating Interactions with Law Enforcement at Farmers Market. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Bella O'Connor, and I'm one of the Legal and Policy Fellows here at the Center for Agriculture and Food Systems. And for those of you who are not previously familiar with our work, the Center for Agriculture and Food Systems, aka CAFS, is a research-based center here at Vermont Law and Graduate School that produces original scholarly research in the field of food and agricultural law and policy in order to serve the broadest range of food system stakeholders. And with local, regional, national, and our international partners, CAFS addresses food system challenges related to a wide variety of topics like food and nutrition security and affordability, farmland access, food system workers' rights, farm viability, local economies, and public health, amongst many more. CAFS also works closely with its partners to provide law and policy support and develop resources that respond to those needs. And through our Food and Agriculture Clinic and Research Assistant Program, students work directly on projects alongside partners nationwide, engaging in really innovative work that spans throughout the food system. And one area of our work that we're going to be discussing today is, of course, our Farmers Market Legal Toolkit, which is one of the longest standing projects here at CAFS. And we feel really fortunate to have been able to provide support to farmers markets across the country for over a decade now using this tool. So, in short, we developed the Farmers Market Legal Toolkit in partnership with the Farmers Market Coalition and the Northeast Organic Farming Association of Vermont, some of whom may be here today. So, welcome and thank you for joining. Essentially, to help farmers markets throughout the US by providing open source legal tools to inform market leaders as they make decisions to help build and grow their markets. And specific topics were selected really just in response to recurring questions from market leaders, and it's organized into three primary sections. So, one provides information on picking a business structure, the second provides information on implementing SNAP and EBT, and the last provides information on managing common legal risks. But outside of those three main areas, there are also case studies and many more additional resources on the website. And we continue to add resources to the toolkit in response to any new questions from market leaders that we're noticing. And CAFS is addressing the topic of this webinar today at the request of farmers market managers because for many, interacting with law enforcement, particularly immigration agents, can create a lot of confusion and stress. And in large public gatherings like farmers markets, this can heighten the intensity of encounters and make confrontation very difficult to manage. Consequently, many communities have questions regarding market leadership's role in handling encounters with law enforcement and how the law applies in market settings. We believe that understanding how and when individuals can appropriately engage with officers in these environments can serve as a valuable tool to minimize risk, increase public safety, and keep markets running smoothly. So, to help us address some of these issues, we've invited our really amazing speaker that we're so thankful to, and our colleague, Brett Stokes, to chat with us today. So, Brett is an assistant professor of law and the director of the Center for Justice Reform Clinic at Vermont Law and Graduate School. Brett is a graduate of the University of Colorado Boulder and the University of Colorado Law School. Brett brings nearly a decade of immigration practice experience, and he has successfully handled a large number of cases ranging from complex removal defense, family based and humanitarian immigration cases, and appeals before the Board of Immigration Appeals. In his time at VLGS, Brett has been instrumental in expanding students' involvement in a wide array of unique practice opportunities not available to VLGS students, and he hopes to continue to expand these opportunities through the Center for Justice Reform's mission, and he's an expert in these matters. So before we get started, I just have a few more quick housekeeping items to go over. All attendees are going to be muted by default, as you've probably already noticed. So if you'd like to ask a question during our Q&A period, please write it in the chat box on your control panel at any time during the presentation. And while Brett is speaking, we're going to be compiling these into a list and do our best to answer as many as we can when the Q&A session starts. So we'll also be working to address your questions in an upcoming publication, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And so if we don't talk about your question today, just know that an answer will be coming in written form very soon. Lastly, this session is being recorded, and so we're going to send a link to the recording to everyone within the next week, as well as putting it on our website. So if you'd like to watch back or share the link with anybody who wasn't able to attend today, please do so. And so without further ado, I'm going to hand the discussion over to Brett.
Thanks, Bella. Sorry, I had some tech issues on my end unmuting, but here I am. Like Bella mentioned, my name is Brett Stokes. I am the director of the Center for Justice Reform Clinic. At the clinic, my students work on a variety of different cases, both within the criminal justice system as well as the immigration justice system. And today I have been asked and am pleased to discuss with all of you just some information. This is a pretty complex area of law, so I'm definitely going to leave some space for questions at the end. Do my best to respond to those, as well as anyone else on the team can do so as well. That being said, I wanted to start out with a little bit of general information, really to talk about understanding why we're discussing interactions with law enforcement, specifically as it might be relevant or come up at farmers markets. A little bit of information around this dichotomy between public versus private spaces, and we'll talk about why that's important. We'll talk about warrants, and really we'll talk about ways that we might be able to reduce the risk, both to the market itself, the patrons, as well as the vendors. And next slide, Bella. So to start off broadly, again, my expertise, it comes primarily from working within the immigration legal system. That being said, I will be speaking, unless I make a distinction, I will be speaking broadly about law enforcement encounters. Some of this information that I'm providing is specific to immigration agents and law enforcement around that and encounters that people can have with them. But some of it is a little bit more general, as it's put out in our Constitution, the Fourth and Fifth Amendments. But when we're talking about law enforcement encounters, we're talking about typically about two specific things. First, there's a distinction between consensual encounters as well as stops and detentions. Those are three different things, but we're going to talk about them kind of like they're two. Specifically, when we're talking about consensual encounters, these are encounters that are voluntary in nature, or at the very least, these are encounters that after the fact, law enforcement will at a minimum attempt to argue that they are voluntary in nature. In order to determine yourself if they actually are voluntary in nature, indicating whether or not you need to be doing anything, whether you have obligations relative to that encounter, it might be helpful for you to differentiate you or anyone who's just put yourself in the shoes of the person who's having the encounter and asking, am I free to leave? If the answer to that question is yes, that is a consensual encounter. And as a result, there are no affirmative obligations put upon you by law enforcement, whether that's state, local, police, or any other law enforcement agency. That being said, there is this other distinction between what a stop and a detention is. Stops are kind of legally amorphous, and I'm not going to get too into the weeds about this, but for the sake of this conversation, we can talk about them together. Stops are basically like baby detentions or baby arrests. And in order to be able to amount to a stop, an officer, again, whether it's local or state law enforcement or an immigration official, they need to be able to articulate what's called reasonable suspicion of either a crime having been committed or about to be committed, or a civil infraction being committed, such as an immigration violation. Without that reasonable, articulable suspicion, there is no basis to conduct a stop or to detain someone. If you are in a situation where it becomes clear that you have been stopped, for example, you ask that question, am I free to leave? And the answer is no, you know that you are now in the stop area. When it becomes a detention, again, we're not going to get too into the weeds. This isn't a criminal law lecture, but suffice to say, it will become incumbent upon you to then there are certain duties put upon you, such as you may be required to identify yourself. Everybody has the right to remain silent in these situations, and that goes for non-citizens as well. However, in a situation where you are being stopped and an officer may be able to assert that reasonable suspicion in this situation, refusing to respond to questions or identification may be arguably grounds to detain someone. Bella, next slide. I talked a little bit about that already. How do you know? You ask the question, and then from there you move on. Just a quick overview. When we're talking about immigration enforcement, unlike state and local police, where it's probably pretty obvious what departments you're dealing with. Is it a sheriff? Is it, for example, I'm up here in Burlington right now. Is it the Burlington Police Department? Um, is it the state troopers? For immigration, it can be a little bit harder to tell who you're dealing with. There are two specific agencies that you would might be dealing with if you are talking about specifically immigration enforcement. There are technically three agencies that are charged with this. USCIS, who is there at the bottom, is not in charge of actually being what we commonly think of as in charge of enforcing the immigration laws, like out in the street. They are in charge of adjudicating petitions, which is a form of enforcement, and conducting interviews for those affirmative petitions. They are not in charge of going around and arresting folks. So when we are talking about actual police authority, we are talking about either Immigration and Customs Enforcement, which is ICE, or Customs and Border Protection, which is CBP. Here in Vermont, because we are a border state and we are so close to the border, we may interchangeably see either of them. That's not necessarily a reason or cause for alarm. That is just by the very nature of our state. And in fact, if you look at the map of the United States, the vast majority of the country, population-wise, is in an area that is within the operating authority, which is 100 miles from a border of CBP. So in and of itself, seeing CBP is not any necessarily a cause for alarm. There might be some differentiations in their duty. I don't think that those are super relevant to the conversation that we're having today. I'm happy to respond to some of those as they come up. Bella, next slide. So when we're talking about immigration and customs enforcement, or immigration enforcement in general, one of those two agencies, it helps to have a little bit of an understanding about how typically folks may come into contact with immigration enforcement. This is a little bit more simple as it relates to the criminal context, because as we talked about before, if you're having either you have an arrest warrant or you are being stopped or detained for something, there by its very nature there is supposed to be some sort of legally reasonable and articulable suspicion of that crime having been occurred, or of that crime having occurred. That said, in the immigration context, it's maybe most people don't really understand how folks maybe typically come into contact with the immigration justice system. Here is a list of a few of the most common examples, possibly contact with the criminal system, as in perhaps you have recently um, gotten a charge for a crime or a felony or a misdemeanor. That contact can, not always, um, lead to subsequently, by the sharing of that information or the changing of information in like a nationally available database, such as the FBI database, essentially ping that that person might need to have a visit from an immigration official. That's not saying across the board that that's going to result in immigration enforcement, but it could, and it commonly does. Applying for a benefit at USCIS while having a criminal charge or a removal order, perhaps one that was not disclosed. This is a possibility that and one of the reasons why it's so important for folks to work with reputable and licensed immigration attorneys so that they know how to fill out those applications as best as possible so that they can make sure that they're including all of the information, necessary information. And if they're not eligible, which this hypothetical seems to demonstrate here, making sure that or advising that person, hey, you're probably not eligible for this or that or the other reason, probably don't want to apply for that. Um, a permanent resident or a green card holder returning from travel from abroad. That's not necessarily a reason for immigration enforcement, but by its very nature, you're going through customs. That is a law enforcement encounter. Raids and targeted enforcement. We've heard a little bit, at least throughout Vermont, of there being some limited targeted immigration enforcement and raids throughout the state. It's happened throughout the country as well. Those are other areas and mechanisms by which that folks may come into immigration enforcement or may be, have the possibility of being detained. So shifting gears a little bit, those are the reasons why somebody might come into contact with immigration officials. What are the reasons for being detained? Next slide. First and foremost, there is an important distinction here. Up until January 2025, um, on and off, it's changed over the years, but there were these things called enforcement priorities, essentially whereby um, the rationale was essentially that there are so many civil immigration violations occurring every day. There really is no way for the government to enforce all of this all at the same time, even if person X, Y, or Z might be eligible to either or may be subject to a ground of inadmissibility or removability or or in layman's terms, uh, be able to be deported for those things, or at a minimum be put into immigration proceedings. There was these enforcement priorities were something that were implemented several years ago. And essentially, it's a form of prosecutorial discretion, essentially saying like, well, and this is something that was explained at the beginning of the both Trump administrations, is that we're going after we're going after criminals, we're going after terrorists, we're going after this, that, or the other. That's another way of saying we have these enforcement priorities. We are focusing on these types of individuals. However, in practice, throughout the course of this administration, it has become very clear that they are not using any enforcement priorities. And in fact, they are now essentially anyone who is, whether they have no criminal history and even a spotless record of immigration history, they may be subject to possible detention from immigration enforcement. So it's definitely a little, whereas before it might have been unlikely that a person with a certain set of facts might not have been detained or arrested by immigration enforcement. It is now that much more likely that that person could be. Um, Other reasons for possible detention, I just mentioned one of those: lack of lawful status. Anyone who is a non-citizen who doesn't have lawful status to remain in the United States is at risk of being detained. That wasn't always the case because of those enforcement priorities. But as we've seen throughout the course of this administration, that is something that is no longer being adhered to. Criminal related grounds. There are a few of these. I list some of them here, but certainly if somebody is subject to any of those criminal related grounds, those folks are at risk of being detained. Those more often than not must be convictions. In some cases, they can just be charges. Immigration violations or immigration fraud or even allegations of such can be enough to uh, raise the level of that person's risk of being detained, as well as security related grounds. I already mentioned these before because the Trump administration this go around has said, or at the very least, beginning of the administration said that they're going after folks who are gang members and involved in terrorism. So those are the kind of broadly speaking the security related grounds for detaining someone. Next slide. So there's a couple of different enforcement encounters that I wanted to cover here, or possible, essentially examples of how this can kind of come about in a typical fashion. There's really, the way that I think about it, there's three different possible encounters if we're talking about just kind of like general uh, public, the possibility of having an encounter. First is targeted enforcement, and specifically what that means is, like, as an example, ICE or CBP might show up to a particular place or reach out about needing to contact a specific person. So that is targeted, as in there is a specific target that they are looking for. They have information, and in those situations, that might even that information may even include that reasonable articulable suspicion that a civil immigration violation is occurring. Or in the case of a state or local police officer, if they are doing something relative to a targeted enforcement, they are thinking about, maybe they have a warrant for the arrest of that person for a crime, or they are in hot pursuit after a crime has been committed and they have that reasonable articulable suspicion to do that. This by no means is a form of, like, what am I trying to say? Uh, this is my own word. But so phishing. So essentially, um, the law enforcement agency in this scenario doesn't necessarily know what they're looking for. They're just looking for criminal activity. An example of this in the criminal context was this, like, the infamous New York stop and frisk policy, which was deemed unconstitutional, essentially, whereby beat police officers were just roaming around and searching, you know, really anyone that they suspected of criminal activity for no reason other than that they were right there searching for that criminal activity. The same thing can happen in the immigration context as well. So ICE or CBP might show up. They might be posted up outside. In this scenario, we're talking about farmers markets, and or they may reach out to a school or a farmers market management and request information regarding vendors or employees or something like that. Um, And again, this kind of dovetails into that last one, but like an information encounter. This would probably look a little bit more kind of fall. This is kind of a mix between the targeted and the phishing, but a request for information is that, you know, again, the law enforcement agency would reach out to somebody or would show up someplace and request specific information, not just general information. Um, but one thing to note here is that when we are talking about targeted enforcement, when we are talking about phishing, when we are talking about requests for information, all of those, um, those requests or those attempts to have a law enforcement encounter from the law enforcement agency typically require a lot more than just asking. Before we get into the specifics of what is necessary in the context of a farmer's market, I would like to talk about the difference between, and it'll all make sense why we're talking about this in the end, the difference between public and private spaces, specifically at farmers markets. So, well, actually, it doesn't have to be specifically about farmers markets. It can be anywhere. But when we are thinking about public spaces, and when I think of a farmers market, I certainly think of the farmers market as a whole as being a public space. It's typically put on, not always, I assume, um, I'm showing my own naivete because I don't know exactly how all of these markets are put together and run. But I imagine at the very least that there's something that's put forth and is typically done in a public place and the public can access it. Why does that matter? It means typically both the people who are there patroning something like this, as well as the people working there, would typically have a lower expectation of privacy as well. Officers of any law enforcement agency, if it is a public place, would have the ability to enter those spaces. They do not need to have a warrant to enter those spaces. They do not need to have special permission to enter those spaces. If they are public spaces or spaces that are commonly held out as public, even if it's private, um, it would be hard to come up with a reason as to why specifically a police officer or an immigration agent would need to have some sort of other um, credential to enter than the common citizen entering that. As well, private spaces, the distinction here matters. So these are restricted areas. These are areas that we would commonly believe or understand throughout the like based on the Constitution, have a privacy interest in them. As such, we would have there would be no requirement for law enforcement to be able to access those private spaces, except for specific exceptions. And I list out a couple of clearly, or excuse me, I list out a couple of things that make it clear what a restricted area might look like, especially in the context of a farmer's market. Must be clearly marked as being private, must be shielded from public view, or at least attempted to be shielded from public view, and it must be non-mobile. So we're talking about this. Why does this all matter? Well, the reason why all of this matters is because I alluded to this a little bit in the previous slides and just now when we were talking about the public spaces. You cannot in a public space um, keep a public space is a public space, and that's public for you and I, and it's also public for law enforcement. So if we are talking about the distinction, especially in something like a farmer's market, the distinction between public and private spaces, that's where it becomes necessary for us to think about that. Bella, next slide. Why does this matter? It's because when we're talking about public and private spaces and certain information, You have to have a warrant to access them, barring limited exceptions, such as if it's a public space and it is clearly a public space and there's no way of getting around that, or there is an exigent circumstance, such as a risk of flight or some other clearly delineated legal reason that's going to kind of fall in the typical lawyer jargon of it depends, but there might be some sort of other reason why an officer might not need a warrant. But by and large, if we are talking about a private space, or we are talking about private information and protected information, that is shielded from view from law enforcement without a warrant. So there needs to be and this is information that probably a lot of you have heard throughout times. So those sorts of things. Without a warrant, an officer, whether it's a local or state police officer or a immigration police officer, would not be able to access that information without a judicial warrant. So, Bella, next slide. When should a farmers market manager, or whatever the preferred nomenclature we're looking at here, when should a farmers market manager request or comply with an enforcement request for information or access to private spaces? So again, we're talking specifically about information that's being directed to somebody, a manager that maybe has that information, or it's at least thought has that information, or private space. We are not talking about access to the farmers market itself, at least not yet, because as we've talked about before, the way that I see those spaces, it is most likely those spaces are largely going to be public spaces, and though barring access to those to law enforcement is not going to be legally sustainable, most likely. But to the private spaces, as well as access to information, this is what you need. This is a really dumbed down version of this, but you need a search warrant. You need a warrant that has the name or a specific description of what the law enforcement agency is seeking, as well as a judge's signature. Without those things, that warrant is not valid. Next slide, please. These are just a couple of examples of warrants. It's probably kind of hard to see here unless you zoom in really tightly, but you'll see in the first one, this is an example of a federal district court warrant, and it is done for the purposes of carrying out a search warrant in this case. And you'll notice at the bottom, it is signed by a judge there at the bottom. And throughout there, even though it's hard to see, I assure you, it lists out some compelling reasons and specific things that they're looking for. Whereas on the right, this is a commonly used form that is prepared by immigration officers called a Form I-200, which is an example of an administrative warrant. This piece of paper is not equal to the piece of paper on the left. The piece of paper on the right is a self-serving request for information. It amounts to, as we were talking about before, consensual versus stop and detention. This essentially amounts to a request for information. It does not hold the power of a judicial warrant. If you are presented with something like that, and it's like, hey, I need to access this private space, and I have this administrative ICE warrant, that does not give you access to that private space. It does not give you access to that information that you're looking for, those sorts of things. So it's really important to know the difference between those two. Frankly, I do not see a situation. I know that this is a topic that a lot of people want to focus on, but I do not see a situation in which this will actually come up. Reason being is because ICE never has pieces of paper. There will never be, I have never seen one anyway. Or excuse me, I have seen many of these pieces of paper, but never at the time of an arrest actually occurring. So when an immigration official is in the process of conducting some sort of search or those sorts of things, more often than not, they are not going to have either of these forms. And so, by their very nature, much of their requests are going to be what we could deem as consensual. That being said, as soon as there is that element of reasonable articulable suspicion for a stop for some civil infraction, we likely do not, it likely does not rise to the level of a reason to stop someone. So, Bella, next slide. We talked a little bit about this again. I don't pretend to be an expert about the every farmers market in the state. There are a lot of them. I've looked at the map, and a lot of them operate very differently, I'm sure. But one of the things that Bella and CAFs have worked up is that's going to be added to the Farmers Market Legal Toolkit at some point in the coming weeks is essentially you don't have to remember everything I'm saying here today. There's going to be a handy resource that's going to be published by them that has a lot of this information in there and is going to be a quick reference toward, what duties do vendors have, what duties do market managers have, those sorts of things. But one of the recommendations of CAFs, as well as myself, would be this consider creating private spaces at markets. Again, when we're talking about private spaces, the strongest ways to do that would be something that's concealed. So um, I don't need to like split hairs here. We're talking about outdoor areas typically, but something that's concealed as in away from the public view, clearly labeled as private or vendors only, and non-mobile. So tents, sheds, yurts might be enough to say are not mobile, but not trailers or vehicles. Next slide, please. Um, this is a topic that has come up and obviously is something that we have thought a lot about, not just in the context of farmers markets, but also something that I have helped our school, Vermont Law and Graduate School, which is VLGS, think about. This is an example of what I proposed to them as like a way to differentiate between what's a public space and what's a private space. Again, public space, your expectation to privacy is severely limited and your expectation of being able to keep the private out, it is limited as well. But as soon as we enter into the area of restricted access, and you'll notice here, this is locked buildings, this is classrooms, this is kitchens, this is maintenance areas, library during non business hours. All of these were things that we at the school deemed would be private. And as such, access to those areas at any time, or at the very least, at a time that is differentiated here, as in the library during non-service hours, was clear that those were private areas and access to those areas would not be granted unless there was a valid judicial warrant. Next slide. Um, did, this is again showing my naivete in terms of like the management of farmers markets. I'm up here in Burlington right now, in my very hot office because the AC is not working. But I was like, Burlington's Farmers Market. I forget the name of the place that they do it, but I thought of, okay, the blacktop at whatever Pine Street. That's the public area. Everyone can go in there and access that. It's not gated off. Everyone can go there and access that, and that includes law enforcement. However, specific restricted areas that you can think of in that confined area would be locked buildings. Are there buildings that are like in the area that are commonly used by market staff or vendors, those sorts of things? Are there maintenance areas that are kept locked because they contain chemicals or something like that that would be bad for like little Susie to get her hands in? And clearly designated non-mobile areas. Again, we talked a little bit about those things. Even just like a tarped off tent could be enough to be considered, especially if it's clearly labeled as private, is something that could potentially raise to the level of a private area. I see a lot of uh, chats popping up with specific things with lots of what ifs and stuff like that. And I think my answers to a lot of them, I'm not seeing all of them come in, and I'm sure we'll have a chance to answer some of them. It depends. I don't have an answer to everything, but what I can tell you is what the law says. And we can go ahead and skip this one for now, I think. And I just want to, just based on time and everything like that, give us enough opportunity to have some Q&A as well as for Bella to chime in here. Just some other considerations and frequently asked questions. I want to flag up front that law enforcement tactics, whether it's state or local or federal, may violate the law. You may very well be in the right that what is happening, what you're witnessing, is not how I'm explaining it to you. You may very well see an arrest occur or hear about an arrest that occurred without all of those things that they're supposed to list out. There may be was no reasonable articulable suspicion for either a crime or an immigration violation. However, even in those moments, oftentimes the safest thing for you or the individual to do is to comply and to document it as best you can so that you can try to challenge it later. Um, that is going to end up being the safest thing that you can do, especially in this day and age, where you just don't know what happened, what could happen, even if you are in the right legally and you know yourself to be. It is incumbent upon you to understand what the risk of making a particular um, decision is. If you're a market manager, it might make sense for you to designate a point person for interactions with law enforcement. That is even something that could be done, even if your market is one that is completely public, as I think most of these are, that anyone can go to. It might make sense to have somebody who is trained and willing to go and talk with law enforcement if they are just kind of bopping around or like talking to patrons to try to figure out why they're there. Not in a way that says, hey, you can't be here unless it is truly a private area, but to try to figure out what exactly it is that they're doing, especially because their presence is something that could, arguably affect business. So I think that it is certainly of everyone's best interest for there to be a designated person to have those conversations, as well for somebody to review warrants if it does become relevant and necessary. Again, even though it is a sexy topic that gets talked a lot about, I think the chances of there actually being a situation where there is a warrant being presented at a farmer's market is probably pretty small. But all the more reason to be prepared for that, because even though it's small, it doesn't mean it's zero. And having somebody who is there to be able to say, you can access this private space or you can access this information, and they know what to look for in a warrant is beneficial. Um, One other thing, nothing I or any expert can tell you will completely mitigate anybody's risk. I am providing you with both a combination of my opinion, my research, as well as my opining on what the law says. Nothing that I say here is legal advice. I am just providing you with the information as I see it. And I want to be clear as well that you might be hearing all of this and feeling a little bit flustered or feeling a little bit like I don't know what I'm going to do in these situations. Um, Everyone has to decide what type of risk they're willing to take. And all I can tell you is that, broadly speaking, there are ways to mitigate and keep ourselves safe at farmers markets, especially. And if that, even with those safeguards in place, is something that you are not willing to take on yourself, I think that's a consideration that you need to listen to. And all that being said, we are all in this together, and there is a big just movement and of support both for farmers markets, obviously, because we are Vermont, we love farmers markets, as well as our non-citizen neighbors and friends and family members. And we want to make sure that everyone feels safe in our communities and feels safe coming to the markets. And so with that, I leave you with that. And I pass back to Bella for all of the next stuff.
Wonderful. Well, Brett, thank you so much. That was so much really valuable information and a lot of great photos, I might add. So, for the sake of time, I'll just go ahead and jump into our audience questions. We have a lot. We have about 10 minutes, more or less, for our questions. So, the first question that we have, I guess, kind of goes back to early questioning and stops. And so, the first question is about you mentioned that someone is able to ask if they are free to leave to determine if they have to give an officer certain types of information. But is someone else able to ask on behalf of another individual that they're free to leave? Maybe someone who's witnessing the encounter?
Um, I guess theoretically, yes. As long as if it is asked if a person is free to leave, is this person being detained? Um, it would, and it's clear what the answer is. I don't see a reason why it wouldn't be permissible for someone else who's witnessing to ask that.
Mm. Okay, great. And I guess building off of that, how would somebody go about politely refusing to answer specific questions if someone wanted to ask information about a vendor or a shopper who wasn't themselves? How can you do that, or can you do that?
I think that so if what the question is somebody is law enforcement, let's say, is approaching you. I don't know what your role is, but let's just say they're approaching you as a private citizen to ask you about information about XYZ. You are, and you don't know the information, or you don't have any reason, like a warrant, to provide the information. I think that I, in this hypothetical, I do not see a reason why you would not be able to say, I respectfully decline to provide that information. And then again, without a lawyer signed by, or it's not a lawyer, a warrant signed by a judge.
Hmm. Okay, great. Thanks for clarifying. We also had a lot of questions about the difference between public and private spaces, and so I was wondering if you could provide a little bit of clarity there. A lot of the questions that we got centered around how ownership impacts certain constitutional protections. So, for example, if there was a privately owned market that operated outdoors, if it's on private land, does that impact the analysis? Is that a material part of the test? Or is location as opposed to ownership structure really more what we need to be thinking about?
So that's a good question. And like the idea of private property. So let's talk about specifically like a home. That's like that is the form of a private, that's the pinnacle example of what a private space is. That's not what we're talking about. But The home, at no point would law enforcement or or immigration or just like law enforcement in general have authority to enter a home without a warrant, except for very, very, very narrow specific circumstances that we're not even going to get into here. Um, that would not be permissible. However, when we are talking about land that, and like the curtilage of someone's land, even that expectation of privacy, especially if you can see it from space that is public and those sorts of things, is maybe diminished a little bit, but it's still recognized. That being said, take it one step further. We're talking about a farmer's market that ostensibly, even though it's operating on private land and is privately run, those sorts of things, ostensibly, unless it is like a ticketed event or there is some sort of barrier that there's like some sort of, I don't know, like a something that has to happen in order for you to be admitted to that area. It's public. And so for when that private land is being operated like a farmer's market in a way that it's open to everyone, unless it is a ticketed event or unless it is closed off, I think you would be pretty, it would be hard to argue that that is what would be considered a private space, because that's a space that everyone can access. So I think that your expectations of privacy there would be equally limited.
Okay,
But it's a
great.
good distinction.
Yes, definitely. And I appreciate you clarifying. Could you also chat a little bit about what types of information officers can look for or what's common to look for? Somebody asked a question about SNAP transactions at farmers markets. And so, of course, they would have people's names, certain dates of attendance, that person's SNAP balance. Are people entitled to that information, or should people be concerned about that information being shared at all?
Great question. Absolutely not. Again, that access to that information, if we're talking about like specific transaction records, and specifically, I mean, we don't even have to get as specific as like Snap, but let's say hypothetically, law enforcement comes to a farmer's market and is asking every vendor for a list of like the Snap transactions. They would absolutely, like, not in a million years, be able to access that without a warrant. And I think they'd have to have a pretty good reason to have a warrant such as that. So I don't necessarily see something like that happening. That is like a really good example of the type of information that absolutely would be private. Um, Again, absent a warrant. And even then, something as broad as like all Snap transactions, I could probably sit here and think of some sort of legally justifiable reason to create a warrant for something like that, but I'd be hard pressed to do so. And I think that something as broad as that would not stand up in a court. I think it would have to be much more narrow and specific.
Okay, great. Another common question that we got is, and I know we won't get too into the weeds about specific situations, but in general, when you think about an open outdoor air farmers market, and you think of maybe a vendor booth that is comprised of a table, maybe an umbrella or something like that, do you think that an open vendor booth would broadly be considered a public or a private space? Or could you give a little bit of insight into why that might be?
I think that if we go back to our examples before, which I have seen the draft of so far, the CAF's resource that they're creating, I think will have a really good explainer of kind of like what to look for in this like private versus public dichotomy. But one of the things to look for here is it like is it concealed? Is it shielded from public view? If we're talking about um a vendor's booth in and it's probably viewable, we're probably talking about something. It's maybe not all the way public, especially maybe behind behind the table. That's maybe we're kind of splitting hairs there constitutionally in terms of like we're kind of like where do we live here? It's probably somewhere between public and private. It's probably just like considered a limited access area. But whatever is visible, I would say would likely be considered public.
Okay, great. Wonderful. Well, Brett, thank you so much. We really appreciate that. I think for the sake of time, we'll just kind of wrap up our Q&A. So yeah, I wanted to thank you so much for providing all of that great info. And then I'll provide just a couple last remarks and things that we'd like you to know moving forward. Um, so, as we mentioned a few times, the catalyst for this webinar is an upcoming resource, excuse me, that's going to be published on the Farmers Market Legal Toolkit website very soon. And as our discussion today highlighted, ensuring that markets really have all the tools that they need to keep their communities safe, secure, and well informed, and of course, are operating on not afoul of the law is really imperative to running a successful season. And so, our upcoming resource is going to be talking a lot about the things that we dove into today with some specific examples. And mainly, we're going to address four key question areas. The first one being how and when do farmers market vendors need to comply with law enforcement? The second being what special obligations do market managers have in their role? The third being what is the difference between public private spaces at farmers markets and kind of diving into the niche areas of law there a little bit more. And then lastly, how do these rules and regulations change depending on the location of the market and where you are in the country? We also just wanted to share that at the end of today's webinar, very shortly when everybody wraps up, everyone is going to receive a final email that contains a link to just a really brief survey asking you if there's any questions or topic areas that weren't addressed in today's talk. And so, if there's anything at all that you'd like to know, we really encourage you to tell us, and we will work to include, to the best of our ability, all of the information upcoming in the resource. And so, as mentioned, we're also going to be adding a recording of this webinar to our website, and we encourage you to share that link with anyone else in your network who may want to watch. You're also welcome to reach out to us on the contact page for the Farmers Market Legal Toolkit website that I have here, or you can email me, contact me personally at my email, and I would be happy to, yeah, explore some of your questions, concerns, get back to you. So thank you so much, everybody. We hope that you have a great afternoon. I'm just going to leave this slide up for a sec in case people want to take a shot. And yes, as Lori mentioned in the chat too, we have a compiled list of all of the questions that were asked today. So we certainly have all of those and we've been tracking and following them. So thank you so much. And thank you again to Brett for taking all of the time and energy to be here with us today. We're really appreciative.